Before we begin tonight's file, I need to ask something of you. This channel, The Midnight File, is new. We're building something here. A place where forgotten stories find their voice again, where justice denied is at least remembered. We're trying to reach 100 subscribers, and I'm asking you now, before this story begins, to be part of that. Subscribe, hit that notification bell. And if this story moves you, disturbs you, or makes you question the systems we trust to protect us, leave a like. We're aiming for 50 likes on this video, 50 people who believe these stories matter. And comment below, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far these files travel, which corners of the world still care about truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Because tonight's story will test that commitment. This is a true story. Paris, June 1981. The City of Light. A place where poets wander the Seine at twilight, where students fill cafes with cigarette smoke and philosophy, where the Sorbonne's ancient walls have witnessed centuries of human brilliance. The chestnut trees were in full bloom that summer, their white flowers falling like snow onto cobblestone streets, still warm from afternoon sun. Tourists photographed the Eiffel Tower, couples kissed on bridges, the smell of fresh bread drifted from boulangeries every morning. Life continued in that beautiful, oblivious way it does in cities, where history has seen everything, and somehow keeps turning anyway. But brilliance and darkness often share the same streets. And on June 11th, in a modest apartment at 10 Rue Erlanger in the 16th arrondissement, something happened that would expose the fragility of justice itself. A crime so disturbing that two countries would spend decades pretending it never occurred. A crime that would reveal how wealth can purchase innocence, how borders can become barriers to accountability, and how a man can commit an act of such depravity that the systems designed to contain him would simply malfunction. Her name was Renee Hartevelt. Say it with me, Renee Hartevelt. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why her name matters more than the name that usually gets associated with this case. 25 years old, Dutch, studying at the Sorbonne, one of the world's most prestigious universities, founded in 1253, where philosophers and theologians and scholars have debated the nature of human existence for nearly 8 centuries. She was pursuing her passion for languages, for the way meaning shifts when you translate poetry from one tongue to another, the way a single word in German might require an entire phrase in French to capture its essence. She had that particular kind of beauty that comes from genuine vitality, tall, especially by the standards of early 1980s Europe, healthy, full of the kind of effortless grace that people either admire or envy. Friends would later describe her as kind, generous with her time. The type of person who would absolutely help a classmate struggling with translation work. The type of person who saw an email or a phone call asking for academic assistance and thought nothing of walking across Paris on a June afternoon to lend her expertise. On that day, she probably dressed casually. This was just a study session after all. Maybe jeans and a simple blouse. Maybe she stopped for a coffee on the way, watching Parisians rush past on their own errands, absorbed in that particular solitude you can only find in big cities where everyone is alone together. Maybe she thought about her plans for the evening, for the weekend, for the summer stretching ahead. At 25, the future still feels infinite. Every door still seems open. She carried books, probably a dictionary, possibly notes in her own handwriting. She had no reason to be afraid. This was a classmate, someone she'd sat near in lectures, someone pursuing the same academic interests, someone who'd asked for help with German poetry. In the world of university students, this was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of afternoon that happens thousands of times across thousands of campuses without incident. She walked up the stairs to apartment number whatever it was. The records don't specify, and perhaps that's a small mercy. She knocked. The door opened. She would never leave that apartment alive. But before I tell you what happened in that room, before we open this particular file and examine its contents, you need to understand something. This isn't just a story about one crime. This is a story about how money can purchase innocence, how borders can become barriers to justice, how a man can devour another human being and then devour the public's attention for profit. This is a story about systems that fail, about victims who vanish twice, once in death and again in the machinery of international law, and about how society sometimes chooses fascination over justice, spectacle over remembrance. If you've never heard of Issei Sagawa, that might be intentional. Some stories are buried not because they're forgotten, but because they're too embarrassing for the institutions that let them happen. Some names disappear from public consciousness because remembering them requires acknowledging failures too profound to contemplate. Let me tell you about the man who walked free. Issei Sagawa was born on April 26, 1949 in Kobe, Japan, a port city rebuilt after devastating earthquakes and World War II bombings, a place that understood destruction and regeneration. He was born into extraordinary wealth. His family owned Sagawa Express, one of Japan's largest transportation and logistics empires, a company that moved goods across the nation, that employed thousands, that generated the kind of money that creates distance from ordinary consequences. Money creates distance from consequence. Remember that. It becomes important. From childhood, something in Sagawa's mind was wrong. He was small, extraordinarily small for reasons that were never fully medically explained. As an adult, he would stand barely 4 feet 9 inches tall, weighing less than 100 pounds, a body that seemed to have stopped growing while his mind continued developing in darker and darker directions. He was bullied, certainly, mocked for his size, made to feel less than, and in that psychological crucible where childhood trauma meets predisposition, meets opportunity, something twisted. He would later claim, in interviews he should never have been granted, that at 7 years old, sitting in a first-grade classroom in Kobe, he looked at a classmate's thigh and thought, "That looks delicious." 7 years old. Most children at that age think about games, about candy, about television shows and playground politics, and the simplicity of a world not yet complicated by adult darkness. But in Sagawa's mind, something had already twisted. A fascination with consuming flesh, with taking vitality from others because he believed his own body was weak, diminished, less than human. As if by eating someone else, he could absorb their strength, their health, their normalcy. It's easy to dismiss this as the false memory of someone constructing a narrative to explain later actions. Maybe he didn't actually think that at 7. Maybe he's retroactively imposing adult obsessions onto childhood memories. But whether the thought occurred at 7 or 17, the pattern is clear. From early in his life, Sagawa's psychology was oriented toward consumption as a solution to inadequacy. As he grew older, or rather, as his body failed to grow while his peers shot up around him, these thoughts intensified. Puberty arrived and twisted everything further. The fascination became sexual. The urges became specific. He fixated on Western women, particularly those who embodied everything he felt he lacked: height, health, physical presence. In his warped psychology, he believed he could absorb their strength by consuming them, as if human flesh were some kind of terrible communion, some sacrament of stolen power. He attended Waco University in Tokyo, studying literature, always literature, as if understanding the artistic representation of human experience might provide insight into his own fractured psyche. He read, he wrote, he fantasized, and at 24 years old, he acted on those fantasies for the first time. It was methodical, which tells you everything about premeditation. He didn't stumble into violence. He planned it. He followed a tall German woman through Tokyo streets one evening, watched where she lived, noted her routine, waited until he knew she'd be asleep. Then, armed with a knife, he broke into her apartment in the middle of the night and attempted to cut flesh from her body while she was unconscious. Imagine waking up to that. Imagine the primal terror of consciousness, returning to find someone standing over you with a blade, having already hurt you. The German woman fought, screamed, managed to push him away despite her terror, despite her injuries. Neighbors heard, police arrived. He was arrested, charged with attempted violation of her person. But here's where the pattern begins, where money first intervenes to erase accountability. Sagawa's father, protective of his family's reputation and his son's future, hired the best lawyers money could buy. More importantly, he approached the victim directly, offered a settlement. We don't know the exact amount. These things are rarely made public. but it was substantial enough to make criminal charges disappear. In Japan's legal system, as in many countries, victims of certain crimes can choose not to prosecute if compensated. It's a controversial practice, one that essentially allows wealthy offenders to purchase their way out of consequences. The German woman, traumatized and perhaps exhausted by the prospect of a lengthy trial in a foreign country, accepted the settlement. Sagawa never confessed his true intentions, the cannibalistic urges that drove him. The legal system saw an attempted assault, not the precursor to something far darker. He was released without prosecution, no criminal record, no psychiatric intervention, no monitoring, and so he learned a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. Money buys second chances. Wealth creates immunity. The normal consequences that bind ordinary people to their actions, those could be negotiated away. Laws, it turned out, were flexible when you had enough yen to bend them. He continued his education. His academic work was apparently strong enough, or his family's donations generous enough, that he earned admission to pursue doctoral studies in literature at the Sorbonne in Paris. One of the world's most prestigious universities opened its doors to him, and in Paris, surrounded by the objects of his obsession, beautiful, healthy Western women walking the same streets, sitting in the same cafes, inhabiting the same spaces, his fantasies intensified. He later admitted brazenly to attempting to lure women to his apartment almost nightly during his time in Paris. Prostitutes mostly. Women whose disappearance might not generate the same attention as a student or a professional. He claimed his nerve always failed, that fear prevented him from acting, that he would point a gun at them but couldn't pull the trigger. Whether this is true or whether there are other victims we don't know about is a question that will never be answered. But the compulsion was there, growing stronger, demanding satisfaction, like a hunger that couldn't be filled by ordinary means. Every woman he saw became a potential victim in his fantasies. Every interaction contained a dark undercurrent, and he was patient, in the way that predators are patient, waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect victim, the perfect confluence of opportunity and courage. Until June 11th, 1981, when Renee Hartevelt knocked on his door. Imagine her perspective for a moment. Really put yourself there. You're 25, studying at one of the world's great universities, surrounded by brilliant minds and beautiful architecture and the romantic mythology of Paris itself. A fellow student, a small, seemingly harmless man you've seen in classes, has asked for help with translation. He's working on German poetry, which is your specialty. This is what academics do. You help each other. Knowledge is meant to be shared. Maybe you're flattered, he asked. Maybe you're just being kind. Maybe you're procrastinating from your own work and this seems like a pleasant distraction. The reasons don't really matter. What matters is trust. You trust that this is what it appears to be. A student needing help, nothing more. You probably thought nothing of the location, his apartment rather than the library. Private tutoring often happens in apartments. It's quieter. You can make tea. It's more comfortable than hard library chairs. No red flags. Just an ordinary academic errand on an ordinary June afternoon. The 16th arrondissement is a nice area. Affluent, safe, filled with diplomatic residences and professional families. The kind of neighborhood where violent crime seems unlikely. You walk up the stairs. Maybe you're thinking about the poetry, about the specific translation challenges of moving between German and French, languages that share some roots but diverge in syntax and mood. Maybe you're thinking about dinner later, about plans with friends, about the perfectly mundane concerns of a graduate student in Paris. You knock. The door opens. Sagawa, small, bespectacled, physically unthreatening, welcomes you in. The apartment is modest. Books everywhere, probably. The desk where he wants you to sit and read. He offers tea, maybe, or water. Normal hospitality, normal courtesy. You sit at the desk. He's given you the poetry, German texts that need translation into French for his research. You begin reading aloud. You're back to him because that's where the chair is positioned, because why would you sit facing him when the work is on the desk in front of you? You trust that the space behind you is safe. Sagawa retrieves a rifle he'd somehow obtained. The exact mechanism was never fully investigated. Though in early 1980s France regulations were different, enforcement looser, and a determined person with money could acquire things that should have been restricted. He stands behind you, aims at the base of your neck. That specific target suggests premeditation. He'd thought about lethality, about which shot would incapacitate instantly, and fires. The sound in that enclosed space must have been deafening. A rifle shot in a small apartment creates a percussion that overwhelms every sense. Renee collapsed forward across the desk, her blood spreading across the pages of German poetry she'd been reading, red ink on black text, the literal dissolution of language and meaning and life. Sagawa would later claim he fainted at the sight, overwhelmed by what he'd done, by the reality of violence versus fantasy. When you fantasize about something for years, the actual moment of execution can create a kind of psychological shock. The fantasy is controlled, perfect, consequence-free. Reality is messy, loud, irreversible. If he did faint, it wasn't for long. When consciousness returned, whether seconds or minutes later, Renee was dead or dying. And something in him didn't feel horror or remorse, or the normal human response to having taken a life. He felt permission. The fantasy he'd nurtured since childhood, the urges he'd suppressed and managed and planned around, could finally be fulfilled. She was here. She was his. No one knew she was in his apartment. He had time. And for the next 2 days, I want you to really understand this time frame, really sit with it. For the next 48 hours, Issei Sagawa systematically desecrated Renée Hartevelt's body in ways that test the limits of human depravity and exceed what I can describe in detail on this platform. He violated her remains multiple times. The psychological literature on necrophilia suggests it's often about control, about intimacy without rejection, about power over someone who cannot resist or judge. Whatever his reasoning, he turned her body into an object for his gratification. Then he attempted to fulfill the primary fantasy, consumption. He tried to bite into her flesh but found his teeth too small, too weak to pierce skin. The human body, it turns out, is tougher than we imagine. Skin is elastic, resistant. His fantasy had never accounted for the practical difficulties of cannibalism without proper tools. So he left his apartment, left Renée's body lying there, walked to a shop somewhere in the 16th arrondissement, and purchased a butcher's knife. Can you imagine being the shopkeeper who sold him that knife? Going about your ordinary day, selling ordinary merchandise, having no idea what it would be used for. That knife, which should have been used for preparing dinner, for cooking, for sustaining life, was instead used to desecrate a person. He returned to the apartment and began cutting. Over the next 2 days, according to his own accounts in interviews and his published memoir, he consumed portions of Renée's body, some raw, testing the texture and taste, some cooked, as if this were simply unusual cuisine rather than an act of profound desecration. He later described preferring certain parts, having preferences about preparation, discussing it with the detachment of a food critic rather than someone describing a crime. He photographed each stage of this process, not quickly, not surreptitiously, but methodically, documenting his crime with the attention to detail of someone conducting a personal experiment. These photographs would later be found by police, evidence so disturbing that they were sealed from public view, though descriptions leaked to media suggest they showed exactly what you'd imagine: a person systematically dismembering and consuming another person. He stored remaining portions in his refrigerator, wrapped in plastic, presumably, tucked between ordinary food items, as if this were normal, as if the appliance designed to preserve food could somehow sanitize this atrocity. The details are too graphic for me to describe fully here. YouTube's guidelines prevent that, but more importantly, human decency prevents it. What you need to understand is the calculated nature of his actions. This wasn't a crime of passion, wasn't a sudden loss of control, wasn't a moment of madness. This was the methodical fulfillment of a fantasy he'd nurtured for decades. Every action was purposeful, every step was chosen. He had 48 hours to stop, to feel remorse, to turn himself in, to do anything that might suggest conscience or humanity. He didn't. And when he was finished, when decomposition made the apartment unbearable, when the smell became too strong to ignore, When reality intruded on fantasy, he packed her dismembered remains into 2 suitcases and decided to dispose of them in the Bois de Boulogne, a large park on the outskirts of Paris. If you're finding this difficult to listen to, I understand. I'm finding it difficult to tell. But here's why these details matter. Because when justice systems fail this catastrophically, we need to remember exactly what they failed to punish. We need to remember Renee, not as a footnote in someone else's twisted narrative, but as a real person whose life was stolen and whose remains were treated with unfathomable disrespect. We need to remember the specific nature of this crime so that we understand the specific nature of the failure that followed. And if you're still watching, if you haven't turned away, subscribe. Because stories like this need to be told, need to be remembered, even when they're uncomfortable, especially when they're uncomfortable. The Midnight File exists to bear witness to failures that shouldn't be forgotten. June 13th, 1981. 2 days after ending Renée's life. The apartment at 10 Rue Erlanger smells of death and decay, despite whatever cleaning Sagawa attempted. He's packed her dismembered remains into 2 suitcases, the kind of luggage you'd take on vacation, now repurposed for horror. They're heavy. Blood seeps through the fabric despite his wrapping efforts. The whole plan, if you can call it that, shows the disconnect between fantasy and reality. In fantasy, disposal is easy. The body disappears. The crime goes undetected. The perpetrator continues their life uninterrupted. But in reality, human bodies are heavy, disposal is difficult, and blood leaves evidence everywhere it touches. Sagawa is 4 feet 9 inches tall, barely 100 pounds, trying to move luggage containing the weight of an adult human being. He struggles getting them down the stairs, struggles carrying them through Paris streets toward the Bois de Boulogne. Every step is conspicuous. Every moment of struggle draws attention. The Bois de Boulogne is a large park, over 2,000 acres of woods and lakes on the western edge of Paris. During the day, it's filled with joggers, families, people walking dogs. At night, it has a reputation for seedier activities. Sagawa apparently chose it because he believed he could dump the suitcases into one of the lakes, and they would sink, disappearing forever. But physics and planning don't align. The suitcases are too heavy for him to carry far. Blood seeps through, leaving a trail on the ground. The smell in June warmth is unmistakable. People notice. A couple walking their dog sees the blood. Their dog probably smells it first. Animals have instincts about death that humans have domesticated away. The couple follows the trail, finds Sagawa struggling with the suitcases near the lake edge. They call police immediately. Joggers pass him and catch the metallic smell of blood. They call police. Multiple witnesses report a small man struggling with blood-soaked luggage, and within an hour, officers arrive. When they open the suitcases, they find exactly what the smell suggested. Human remains, partially wrapped, obviously fresh, dismembered with what investigators would later determine was a large knife. Sagawa is arrested immediately, and here's what's remarkable: he confesses, calmly. Without hesitation, without attempting any kind of excuse or cover story. When asked what happened, he simply states, "I ended her life to consume her flesh." No elaborate excuse, no claim of accident or self-defense, no attempt to minimize or redirect, just a flat admission of premeditated cannibalism. Think about that confession for a moment. Think about what it reveals about his psychology. A normal person caught committing a crime tries to escape consequences, lies, makes excuses, blames the victim, claims misunderstanding. But Sagawa had spent so long fantasizing about this act that part of him wanted recognition for having finally done it. Part of him was proud. In any functional justice system, that would be the end of the story. Confession, physical evidence, victim's body, clear motive, trial, conviction, imprisonment. But remember what I said at the beginning. This isn't a story about one crime. It's about what happens when money meets bureaucracy, meets international borders. Sagawa is held in custody for 2 years awaiting trial. The French system moves slowly. Investigations are thorough, paperwork meticulous. During this time, he's examined by multiple French psychologists and psychiatrists. They interview him extensively, review his history, analyze his actions and statements, and they reach a conclusion that will determine everything that follows. Legally insane. unfit to stand trial. Now, you might think that sounds reasonable. A man who commits cannibalism is obviously disturbed. Obviously, something in his brain isn't functioning the way it should, in any person we'd call sane. But here's the legal trap that's about to spring. Under French law at the time, someone deemed criminally insane cannot be prosecuted. They can't be sent to prison through criminal proceedings. Instead, they must be committed indefinitely to a psychiatric institution. This distinction matters enormously. A prison sentence has a specific length, specific conditions, specific documentation. A psychiatric commitment is supposed to be indefinite until the person is deemed no longer a danger. But the paperwork, the jurisdictional authority, the international implications are all completely different. Judge Jean-Louis Bruguière, a name that should be remembered in the annals of legal failure, reviews the psychiatric evaluations and orders exactly what the law requires: indefinite psychiatric commitment. Sagawa is transferred to a secure mental institution in France. Case closed from the French perspective. A dangerous person has been contained. Justice, in the form of treatment rather than punishment, has been served. But during his confinement in France, something extraordinary happens, something that will eventually provide the excuse France needs to wash its hands of the whole embarrassing affair. A Japanese author named Inuhiko Yamota visits Sagawa in the psychiatric hospital. It's unclear exactly how this visit was arranged, whether Yamota reached out, whether Sagawa's family facilitated it, whether the hospital allowed it as some kind of therapeutic exercise. But it happens, and Yamota, recognizing a story that will sell, encourages Sagawa to write about his crime, to explore the psychological motivations in detail, to create a first-person narrative of exactly what he did and why. And Sagawa does, he writes. In his cell or room or wherever they kept him, he writes about following Renee, about inviting her to his apartment, about the shot, about what followed. He writes about his childhood obsessions, his fantasies, his careful planning. He writes with the kind of detail that only the perpetrator could provide, the kind of intimate knowledge that makes readers feel complicit in the very act of reading. The resulting manuscript is published in Japan in 1983 under the title In the Fog, Kiri no Naka. And it doesn't quietly disappear onto remaindered shelves. It becomes a bestseller. A confessed cannibal's first-person account of his crime, distributed widely, bought eagerly by a Japanese public fascinated by this dark story unfolding in Paris. Media coverage intensifies. Talk shows discuss it. Book clubs debate it. Sagawa's name becomes known throughout Japan. The French government watches this. A Japanese citizen confined at French taxpayer expense, profiting from his infamy while France foots the bill for his indefinite psychiatric care. The media attention grows. Questions are asked in French media about why France is continuing to house him when Japan could handle it. The political pressure builds. And at some point, someone in the French bureaucracy makes a decision. Deport him. Send him back to Japan. Let his home country deal with him. Let this become someone else's problem. In 1984, after intense but quiet diplomatic negotiations, Issei Sagawa is put on a plane to Tokyo. And this is where everything falls apart. If you're angry right now, if you're feeling that rising sense of injustice, then leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me if you believe in the systems that are supposed to protect us, or if stories like this have eroded that faith, because what happens next is somehow even more disturbing than the crime itself. Here's where the catastrophic failure occurs. Here's where two countries, through a combination of bureaucratic incompetence and willful blindness, manage to let a confessed cannibal slip through the cracks of international law and walk free. When France deports Sagawa, they seal his court documents. Under French legal procedure at the time, because he was declared insane rather than criminally convicted, and because the charges are being dropped upon deportation, those documents become classified. They're archived, locked away, and critically, catastrophically, they're never transmitted to Japanese authorities. Think about that. A man who confessed to premeditated cannibalism is being sent from one country to another, and the receiving country gets no official documentation of his crime. No evidence, no confession records, no psychiatric evaluations, no crime scene photographs, nothing. Why? Because technically, from France's bureaucratic perspective, Sagawa wasn't convicted of a crime. He was declared insane. The charges were dropped as part of the deportation agreement. And without charges or conviction, there's no legal obligation under 1984 international protocols to transmit criminal documentation. It's a loophole big enough to drive a truck through, or in this case, to let a cannibal escape justice entirely. Japan receives Sagawa with minimal information. They know he was involved in some incident in France. They know he was in a psychiatric facility. But the specific details, the evidence, the full horror of what he did, all of that is locked in sealed French archives that will remain sealed for decades. Upon arrival in Tokyo, Sagawa is immediately admitted to Matsuzawa Hospital, a psychiatric facility. Japanese doctors begin their own evaluation. They interview him, review whatever limited information they have, and they reach a conclusion that will determine whether he ever faces consequences. Sane. The Japanese psychiatrists determine that Sagawa's actions were motivated by sexual deviance and violent fantasy, but that sexual deviance alone doesn't constitute legal insanity under Japanese legal standards. They find him mentally competent, capable of understanding right from wrong, able to control his actions, therefore sane. So now you have a man who France called insane, who Japan calls sane, who has confessed to an atrocity, but who exists in a legal void that neither country can or will address. Without the French documents, Japanese authorities have no evidence to charge him with anything. They have his word that something happened in Paris, but hearsay isn't sufficient for prosecution. They need physical evidence, witness statements, crime scene documentation, all the things that are sitting in sealed archives in France. Without a conviction in France, they have no legal basis to detain him indefinitely. If France had convicted him and then deported him, Japan could have enforced that sentence or added additional penalties. But France didn't convict him. France declared him insane and then dropped all charges. From Japan's legal perspective, there's no crime to prosecute. And because France dropped all charges, rather than deporting him with an active criminal conviction, Japanese law provides no mechanism for continued detention. He's not serving a sentence. He's not awaiting trial for a crime committed on Japanese soil. He's simply a Japanese citizen who had some psychiatric issues in France, received treatment, and is now receiving continued evaluation in Japan. The Japanese legal system finds itself in an impossible position. They know he did something terrible, but they have no legal framework to address it. They can hold him in Matsuzawa Hospital for evaluation, but only as long as he's deemed a danger to himself or others. And if their psychiatric evaluation determines he's sane and not currently dangerous, they have to release him. On August 12th, 1986, less than 5 years after he ended Renee Hartevelt's life and desecrated her remains in ways I still can't fully describe on this platform, Issei Sagawa checks himself out of Matsuzawa Hospital. He literally checks himself out. Like you'd check out of a hotel, signs some paperwork, thanks the staff, and walks out the front door into the streets of Tokyo. A free man. Let that sink in for a moment. Really absorb it. 5 years. For premeditated ending of a life and cannibalism. And then, freedom. Not parole, not probation, not ankle monitors or check-ins or restrictions, just freedom. Renee Hartevelt was 25 years old. She had approximately 50 years of life ahead of her. Career, love, family, contributions to the world we'll never know because they never happened. She got 0 years. Sagawa got 36 years of freedom, plus the years before the crime, plus whatever afterlife or oblivion awaits. He got everything she didn't. And if you think that's the worst of it, if you think the story ends with him quietly disappearing into anonymous Japanese society, living out his years in private shame, you don't understand how broken our relationship with crime and celebrity has become. In any reasonable world, in any society with functioning moral standards, Sagawa would have disappeared into obscurity, would have changed his name, moved to a remote area, lived quietly under the weight of what he'd done, even without legal punishment. Social ostracism should have followed. People should have refused to associate with him, employ him, publish him, give him platforms. He should have been shunned. But we don't live in a reasonable world. And what happens next stands as one of the most morally bankrupt chapters in modern media history. Sagawa becomes a celebrity, not immediately, not overnight. These things happen gradually, each small compromise leading to larger ones, each interview paving the way for the next, until somehow a confessed cannibal is appearing on television and people have normalized it. His book, In the Fog, is already a bestseller before he's even released from Matsuzawa Hospital. Japanese readers have consumed his first-person account with fascination and horror. The media has covered his case extensively. By the time he walks out of that hospital in 1986, he's already a known figure. And rather than treating this notoriety as something shameful, something to escape, he leans into it. He begins giving interviews. First to small publications, then to larger ones. He's articulate, educated, speaks multiple languages. He can discuss literature and psychology and philosophy. He presents his crime as a kind of extreme psychological case study, himself as an interesting subject for examination rather than a person who should be perpetually apologizing for an unforgivable act. And media outlets, driven by curiosity and ratings and the eternal question of how could someone do that, provide him platforms. They pay him. Not enormous amounts probably, but enough. Enough to live on. Enough to incentivize continued participation in his own celebrity. Between 1986 and 1997, Sagawa is frequently invited as a guest speaker and commentator on various media platforms. Think about that. Invited. People reached out to him, offered him opportunities to speak publicly, provided him forums to discuss his crime and his thoughts and his ongoing psychology. His burgeoning celebrity likely accelerated after 1989, when a truly horrific case captured Japan's attention. Tsutomu Miyazaki ended the lives of several young girls in a series of crimes that traumatized the nation. And Japanese media, in a decision that defies ethical comprehension, descended upon Sagawa's home to ask for his commentary, his expert opinion, as if his history of violence gave him special insight rather than disqualifying him from public discourse entirely. And he gave it. He appeared on camera, discussing Miyazaki's psychology, offering theories about what drives people to commit such acts, positioning himself as some kind of dark expert on human depravity. The media treated him as a resource, a subject matter expert, rather than a perpetrator who should never have been given a microphone in the first place. In 1992, he appeared in Hisayasu Sato's exploitation film Uwakizuma Chijokuzeme, translated as Unfaithful Wife, Shameful Torture. He played a voyeuristic character in what was widely characterized as an adult film. He was acting, in a movie, being paid, treated as a performer rather than a criminal. He authored numerous books beyond In the Fog. He wrote Shonen A, examining the 1997 Kobe child incidents. He produced graphic manga comic books depicting his own crime in explicit, unrelenting detail. Not vague allusions, detailed illustrations showing exactly what he did. These were published, distributed, sold in bookstores. He wrote restaurant reviews for the Japanese magazine Spa. Restaurant reviews, a cannibal critiquing food. The irony was apparently lost on his editors, or perhaps they found it edgy, provocative, the kind of thing that generates controversy and attention and ultimately revenue. He painted himself as a cultural commentator, someone whose opinions on cuisine and culture and society were worth publishing and reading. Magazines paid him directly for interviews and stories. Shukan Asahi and Shukan Gendai, major Japanese publications, featured him prominently. Not as a cautionary tale, not as an example of justice failed, but as a fascinating figure, a dark celebrity worth following. Public reaction was mixed. Some Japanese readers were fascinated by his story, drawn to the taboo nature of it, the same impulse that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. Others were repulsed, vocally critical, demanded that media stop platforming him. But the mixed response was enough. As long as some people were interested, as long as controversy generated attention, the platforms continued. Eventually, the backlash grew strong enough that he was labeled a folk devil, a sociological term for someone who becomes a symbol of societal fears and moral panic. But labeling him didn't silence him, didn't remove his platform. It just became part of the narrative, part of the controversy that kept him relevant. Through all of this, and this is the part that should disturb you most, Sagawa showed virtually no remorse. Not the performative remorse that criminals sometimes offer when seeking parole. Not the calculated apologies designed to rehabilitate public image. Nothing. If anything, his interviews revealed a man still consumed by the same obsessions that drove him to commit his crime in the first place. In 2009, Vice magazine interviewed him. Vice, a media outlet that built its brand on gonzo journalism and boundary-pushing content, sent reporters to Tokyo to sit down with the aging Cannibal. And the interviewer asked a question that gets at the heart of his psychology. Did he actually intend to end Renee's life, or did he just want to taste her flesh? His response, "Nobody believes me, but my ultimate intention was to consume her, not necessarily to end her life. I wanted her to let me taste a bit of her flesh while she was still alive." Read that again. While she was still alive. He wanted to eat parts of her body while she was conscious, while she could feel it, while she could experience the horror of being consumed. This isn't remorse. This is fantasy still active, still detailed, still precisely articulated decades after the fact. And Vice published it, gave him the platform to express these thoughts to an international audience. In the same interview, he admitted brazenly to attempting to lure women, prostitutes mainly, to his Paris apartment almost nightly before Renee. Said he would point guns at them, but his nerve would fail. Described the logistics of his failed attempts with the same casual tone someone might use to discuss missed opportunities in business or romance. The 2011 interview with Vice was even more disturbing. When asked about women around him currently, not in the past, not hypothetically, but in his present-day life, he stated, "I think they would taste delicious." Present tense. Not "I used to think," but "I think." Current, ongoing, active fantasies decades after being released, decades after allegedly receiving psychiatric treatment, decades after the world decided he was safe enough to walk free among the population. And journalists kept coming back, kept asking questions, kept publishing his responses, because controversy sells, because dark stories attract readers, because there's a market for the morbid, and Sagawa understood that market better than most. Share this video if you think these failures need to be remembered, not because the story is entertaining, but because justice delayed is justice denied, and in Renee's case, justice wasn't just delayed, it was completely abandoned. Your share might reach someone who needs to understand how badly systems can fail when we let them. In 2017, 36 years after the crime, when Sagawa was 68 years old, Harvard-based anthropologist filmmakers Lucien Chastain-Taylor and Verena Paravel released a documentary called Cannibal. These weren't tabloid journalists or sensationalist media figures. These were academics affiliated with one of the world's most prestigious universities, and they chose to create an intimate, experimental film about the aging Sagawa. They spent extensive time with him, filmed him in his apartment, in his wheelchair by that point, discussing his crimes and thoughts and ongoing psychology. The footage was described as intimate, close-ups of his face, his hands, his physical deterioration. They captured him eating, filmed his mouth in graphic detail, made artistic choices that some critics called provocative and others called exploitative. The directors deliberately chose not to condemn him in the film. They presented him as what they called a complex figure, giving him a platform to articulate his perspective without challenge, without moral judgment, without the voices of those who might represent Renee's family or the broader societal consensus that some acts place you beyond redemption. When challenged about this approach, when critics asked why they would give more attention to someone who'd already received far too much, Chastain-Taylor argued that refusing to represent Sagawa or give him voice constituted a form of intellectual cowardice and moralism. Let me repeat that. Intellectual cowardice and moralism. As if having moral standards, as if believing some people shouldn't be platformed, as if thinking that victims deserve more consideration than perpetrators, as if all of that is cowardice rather than basic human decency. The defense continued. We're exploring complexity, examining the full spectrum of human experience, refusing to reduce people to simple categories of good and evil. It's the same defense that media has used for decades when platforming extremists, violence perpetrators, and people whose actions should have rendered them permanently unwelcome in public discourse. But here's what that defense ignores. Complexity doesn't require a platform. Understanding doesn't require celebration. You can acknowledge that human psychology is complicated without giving someone who committed atrocity after atrocity a documentary that will preserve their words for future generations. Critics countered, rightly, that extensive media attention to violent offenders creates the celebrity they crave, that it normalizes their actions by treating them as subjects worthy of prolonged artistic examination, that it provides incentive for others who seek notoriety, showing them that infamy can be transformed into fame with enough time and the right media partners. But the documentary was released anyway. It played at film festivals. Critics reviewed it. Some praised its experimental approach, its refusal to moralize, its artistic courage. Others condemned it as giving platform to evil, as exploiting a victim's memory for art, as fundamentally misunderstanding the responsibility that comes with documentary filmmaking. And Sagawa got exactly what he'd wanted for decades: more attention, more people knowing his name, more discussions of his psychology, more documentation of his thoughts preserved for posterity. Meanwhile, Renee Hartevelt remained a footnote, the promising young Dutch student who loved languages and poetry and trusted a classmate enough to help him on a June afternoon. She existed in these discussions only as the object of Sagawa's crime, never as a person with her own story, her own complexity, her own right to be remembered as something other than a victim. Her family tried to seek justice. Sources suggest they pledged to push for prosecution in Japan to ensure that the one who harmed their daughter would never go free. But sealed French documents and jurisdictional gaps defeated them. They were ordinary people facing international legal complexity, bureaucratic indifference, and a media landscape that found their daughter's destroyer more interesting than their daughter's memory. What do you say to parents in that situation? Sorry, the paperwork got lost between countries? Sorry, psychiatrists disagreed about diagnosis. Sorry, your daughter's final moments became someone else's best-selling memoir. There is no sorry adequate for that level of failure. No apology that restores what was taken. No explanation that makes it acceptable. As Sagawa aged, his body finally began to betray him the way he'd always believed it had. In November 2013, at age 64, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke that permanently damaged his nervous system. The man who'd obsessed over physical vitality, who'd believed he could absorb strength by consuming others, found himself partially paralyzed and weakened. For the final 9 years of his life, he lived in a small apartment in suburban Tokyo, far from the media spotlight that had sustained him for so long. He required daily assistance from his younger brother or paid caregivers. Eventually, he was confined to a wheelchair, dependent on others for basic tasks, experiencing the very physical vulnerability he'd spent his life resenting and trying to overcome through atrocity. There's no justice in this, no karmic balance. A stroke is a medical event, not divine punishment. But there is perhaps a certain symmetry in a man who fetishized physical power, ending his life entirely dependent on others, stripped of the autonomy he'd stolen from Renee so completely. Even then, even weakened and elderly and facing his own mortality, he continued giving interviews. He was less mobile, less energetic, but his mind remained active, and his willingness to discuss his crimes never diminished. In 2013, he claimed in one interview that he'd abandoned his violent obsessions, said he no longer thought about those things, suggested that age and illness had finally brought him peace from the urges that had dominated his psychology for over 6 decades. But observers familiar with his decades of contradictory statements viewed these claims with deep skepticism. This was a man who'd shown no remorse for 30 years, who'd built a career monetizing his notoriety, who'd repeatedly discussed ongoing fantasies in interviews. Does someone like that suddenly develop conscience at age 64? Or do they simply realize that death is approaching and want to adjust their final narrative, add one last lie to decades of calculated self-presentation? We'll never know. What we do know is that on November 24, 2022, Issei Sagawa passed away at age 73 from complications of pneumonia. He died in his apartment, presumably with family nearby, his death as unremarkable as his life should have been. His funeral was attended only by relatives. No public ceremony. No media coverage of note. No retrospectives celebrating his complex life or his artistic contributions. He died the way he should have lived after 1981. Quietly, anonymously, his name carrying no weight beyond the shame it should have always borne. But the damage was done. He'd lived freely for 36 years after his crime, published numerous books, made money, appeared on television. Influenced popular culture to the point that rock bands referenced his story in songs. The Rolling Stones' Too Much Blood from their 1983 album Undercover, and the Stranglers' 1981 song La Folie. His infamy had transcended borders, languages, decades, and Renée Hartevelt, 25 years old when she died, never got to be 26, never published a book, never appeared on television, never influenced culture, never had the chance to become whatever she might have become, translator, professor, writer, mother, any of the 1,000 possibilities that exist in a life lived fully. She got a grave somewhere in the Netherlands, presumably, a stone with her name and dates. 1956 to 1981, 25 years. That's what the world gave her. That's what justice looked like in her case. If you've made it this far, if you've spent almost an hour listening to this file, then hit that like button. We're still trying to reach 50 likes, 50 people who believe that bearing witness to injustice matters even when it's uncomfortable. Even when the story offers no resolution, no satisfying ending, no restoration of balance. So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to do with this information, these failures, this catalogue of institutional incompetence and media complicity and societal fascination with darkness? Let me pull back and examine the systemic failures that converged to create this catastrophe, because understanding how it happened is the first step toward ensuring it doesn't happen again, though I'm not confident it won't. First failure, wealth and privilege. Sagawa's father bought his son out of his first offense in Japan. That early intervention taught the lesson that consequences were negotiable, that money created distance from accountability. When Sagawa was later evaluated in France, his family's resources likely funded excellent legal representation that could influence psychiatric findings, suggest specific diagnoses, frame his actions in ways that led to an insanity determination rather than a criminal conviction. We can't prove direct corruption, but we can observe the pattern. At every juncture where Sagawa should have faced justice, wealth provided an exit. Second failure, the French legal system's approach to criminal insanity. By declaring Sagawa insane, France prevented prosecution, but also created the bureaucratic conditions for his eventual freedom. Had he been tried and convicted as a criminal, the documentation would have followed him internationally. Japanese authorities could have enforced or extended his sentence, and he would have remained incarcerated. But the insanity finding, while perhaps medically justified, created a legal category that allowed him to slip through administrative cracks. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions and psychiatric diagnoses. Third failure, international legal gaps. In 1984, cooperation between France and Japan on criminal matters was limited. There were no automatic documentation transfers, no standardized protocols for handling deportations of dangerous individuals, no treaties ensuring that evidence would follow perpetrators across borders. Deportation without transmitted evidence created a jurisdictional void where accountability simply vanished. Sagawa existed in the space between two legal systems, claimed by neither, punished by neither. Fourth failure, divergent psychiatric opinions. French doctors said insane. Japanese doctors said sane. Same man, same crime, same history, opposite conclusions. This raises profound questions about the reliability of psychiatric evaluation as the basis for legal decisions. If experts examining the same individual can reach contradictory diagnoses, how can we build legal systems that depend on those diagnoses? What does it mean for justice if mental health evaluation is more art than science, more interpretation than fact? Fifth failure, media complicity. This might be the most preventable failure of all. Japanese media transformed Sagawa from anonymous criminal to public figure. They didn't have to. Journalists could have collectively refused him platforms. Editors could have declined to publish his books. Television producers could have said no to interview requests. Publishers could have recognized that some stories shouldn't be told by perpetrators, that giving voice to violence normalizes it. But sensationalism sells. Controversy generates attention. Dark stories attract readers and viewers, and economic incentives overwhelmed ethical considerations at every turn. Sixth failure: cultural tolerance. I'm cautious about overgeneralizing here, about suggesting that Japanese culture specifically enabled Sagawa when every culture has its own relationship with violence and celebrity and the boundaries of acceptable public discourse. But something allowed him to thrive in Japan when many other countries would have socially ostracized him, even without legal punishment. Whether that's cultural fascination with taboo subjects, or media landscape differences, or simply the particular moment in Japanese society when his story emerged, whatever the factors, they combined to provide him opportunities that should never have existed. These 6 failures: wealth, legal procedure, international gaps, psychiatric inconsistency, media ethics, and cultural tolerance, converged around one man and allowed him to evade justice entirely. And the 7th failure, perhaps the greatest: collective memory and institutional learning. Most people have never heard this story. The systems that failed didn't just fail once, they failed to learn, to reform, to ensure it couldn't happen again. Has France changed its deportation protocols for individuals deemed criminally insane? Has international law evolved to prevent similar jurisdictional voids? Have media ethics improved regarding platforming violent offenders? I'd like to think so, but similar cases continue emerging where perpetrators gain celebrity, where victims are forgotten, where systems fail in predictable ways. The Sagawa case should be taught in law schools as an example of every possible failure point in international criminal justice. It should be examined in journalism classes as a cautionary tale about media ethics and the responsibility that comes with platforms. It should be discussed in psychiatry programs as evidence of diagnostic inconsistency and the dangers of building legal systems on subjective medical opinions. But it isn't. It's mostly forgotten, except by true crime enthusiasts and people who stumble across the story and can't quite believe what they're reading. Renee Hartevelt's name should be attached to international justice reforms, to protocols ensuring that evidence follows dangerous individuals across borders, to treaties preventing jurisdictional gaps from swallowing accountability. Instead, she's a footnote in discussions of her destroyer, mentioned briefly and then overshadowed by the grotesque details of what was done to her. Let me tell you what haunts me most about this file. It's not the specific details of the crime, though those are horrific enough. It's not even the legal failures, though those represent catastrophic breakdowns in systems we're supposed to be able to trust. What haunts me is the inversion of memory. The perpetrator lived 36 years free and became famous. The victim died at 25 and became forgotten. That inversion, where the person who committed atrocity gets books and interviews and documentaries, while the person who suffered gets silence, represents a fundamental failure of collective ethics. We did this, not individually perhaps, but collectively. Media outlets that published his stories, readers who bought his books, viewers who watched his interviews, filmmakers who documented his thoughts, all of us participating in a system that rewards notoriety over virtue, controversy over dignity, perpetrators over victims. And before you think I'm exempt, before you assume I'm standing in judgment from some moral high ground, I'm part of this too. I'm telling this story right now, speaking Sagawa's name, describing his crimes in detail, giving him more attention, even while criticizing the attention he received. The difference, I hope, is emphasis and intention. I've tried to center Renee in this narrative, to remind you of her name, to insist that she matters more than he does. But I'm still telling his story because it reveals something we need to understand about how systems fail. There's a tension here that I don't know how to resolve. These stories need to be told so we remember the failures and hopefully prevent future ones. But telling them gives perpetrators exactly what many of them crave: attention, notoriety, the immortality of being remembered. How do we bear witness to injustice without inadvertently celebrating the unjust? How do we examine how systems fail without making celebrities of those who exploit those failures? I don't have good answers, just the conviction that silence is worse, that forgetting is worse, that pretending these failures didn't happen because acknowledging them is uncomfortable. That's worse than the tension of telling stories that make us complicit in attention we wish perpetrators never received. Renee Hartevelt was 25 years old, born in 1956 in the Netherlands, grew up in a country still rebuilding from World War II, in a culture that valued education and international cooperation and multilingualism. She was bright enough to earn admission to the Sorbonne, dedicated enough to pursue graduate studies in a foreign country, navigating a language that wasn't her native tongue, building a life in Paris while maintaining connections to home. She loved poetry, loved the sound of words in German, the way language could capture emotions that seemed impossible to articulate. She was generous with her time and knowledge, willing to help a classmate who claimed to be struggling. She trusted that academic environments were safe, that fellow students were colleagues rather than threats. On June 11, 1981, she walked to an apartment to help with translation. She was doing exactly what universities are supposed to encourage, sharing knowledge, building community, supporting fellow scholars, and she was destroyed for it. Not just ended, but desecrated in ways that deny her even the dignity of death. Her family lost a daughter, a sister, possibly a friend and confidant and source of pride. Whatever she might have contributed to the world, translations that helped others understand German poetry, teaching that inspired future students, research that advanced her field, or simply the quiet daily contributions of a good person living well, none of that happened. The world got 36 more years of Issei Sagawa instead, books that shouldn't have been published, interviews that shouldn't have been granted, a documentary that shouldn't have been filmed. The Rolling Stones referenced his crime in a song. The Stranglers wrote La Folie, inspired by his story. He became part of popular culture, while Renee became an asterisk. That's the real horror of this case, not just the crime itself, though that was horrific. Not just the legal failures, though those were catastrophic. The real horror is that in our collective response to evil, we so often elevate the evil and forget the victim. We make the perpetrator famous and let the victim disappear into silence. So let me end by doing what I should have done from the beginning, centering Renee completely, speaking her name without his, remembering her as she deserved to be remembered. Renee Hartevelt, born 1956, studied at the Sorbonne, loved German poetry and language, was kind enough to help a classmate, was 25 years old with her whole life ahead of her, was a daughter and likely a sister and certainly a friend, deserved justice and never received it, deserved to be remembered and was mostly forgotten. Until now. Until this moment. Until you, listening to this file, make a choice to remember her name instead of his. If you take nothing else from this story, take that. Remember victims, say their names, insist they matter more than the people who harmed them. Because every time we let perpetrators dominate the narrative, we complete the injustice that began with their crimes. Renee Hartevelt. Say it with me one more time. Renee Hartevelt. That's who this story is about. That's whose name deserves to be remembered. That's who justice failed, who systems abandoned, who we collectively forgot in our fascination with darkness. Don't forget her now. The Midnight File will return soon with another case, another examination of how systems fail, and victims are forgotten, and justice becomes negotiable when money and power are involved. If stories like this haunt you the way they haunt me, if you believe that bearing witness matters, that remembering victims matters, that holding systems accountable matters, then subscribe. Turn on notifications. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about these failures, because the next file might be darker still. The next story might reveal even more catastrophic failures, even more tragic victims, even more ways that our systems and societies prioritize perpetrators over the people they harm. Someone needs to keep these stories alive. Someone needs to remember the victims. Someone needs to ask the uncomfortable questions about why justice fails and how we can possibly prevent it from failing again. Thank you for listening. Thank you for spending this time with Renee's story. Thank you for remembering her name. And thank you for understanding that some stories are worth telling not because they're enjoyable, but because they're necessary. This is Julian Cross closing tonight's file, but the questions it raises, those stay open. The failures it exposes, those demand answers. And Renee Hartevelt? Her name deserves to be spoken, remembered, and honored long after the name of the person who harmed her has faded into deserved obscurity. Sleep well if you can. And remember, every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. But some secrets, some failures are too important to stay buried. Until next time.